I'm going to bring up our dueling pollsters from two different political parties. There are some pollsters who are just so smart and so wise that every time you listen to them, that you learn something. So one of them is Whit Ayres, who I had the pleasure of meeting for the first time when I was political director at Campaigns and Elections magazine in 1989. So that goes back a long time ago when both of us were young and people were saying, there's this guy and he is just so smart. And he would write for the magazine and I would say, yeah, he is just so smart. And he's one of the leading Republican pollsters who is out there on the planet. The second is the boss of the speaker, who is Stan Greenberg, who Erica works with, and Stan is traveling and could not be in this meeting today. I've worked with Stan for 2.5 decades and throughout, like very, very intensively. And when I started working on disability issues, which is less than a year ago, just on volunteer, and this organization is only 3 weeks old now, we wanted to do a poll on voters with disabilities. And he said, I have this young prodigy who's coming up, this woman Erica, and who is very, very skilled, and she can work with you on this project. And I was very happy to bring her in and to get her wisdom. And so she's a young rising star, and so I haven't known her very long, and probably none of you have seen her name before, but she's definitely coming up. So Erica and Whit, we look forward very much to hearing what it is that you have to say. I know that Hillary has to come up and get the PowerPoint slides ready, but come on up. By the way, we're not doing breaks in between the sessions intentionally because we have so many speakers, but if you need to go for a break, then don't hesitate to step out for a few moments and come right back on in. Okay, great.
I didn't get your picture though, I just got the back.
Go.
I think I did. I just did. What?
I know you're going to be here. I want to.
Erica, we're good. Go ahead.
So, this is actually the result of the poll that Jennifer was just talking about that we conducted last summer. And I think that one of the things that I'd like to emphasize is that there is actually very little data nationally and among voters on the issues that people who are related to people with disabilities, what they think, and people who have disabilities. So this is, our poll. It's meager, but it's what we have, and I would emphasize that it's actually public opinion on this area is pretty important. So our key findings were a significant portion of the voting population, and this is all likely 2012 voters, people who were intended to vote in 2012. A significant portion of the population does know someone who has a disability, related or friend or self. There's a divide on whether or not the government is doing enough. And then we asked a series of questions about whether this is an issue on which you intend to vote. And it is very much, you'll see the differences when I go through the data, between those who do know someone who has a disability and those who don't. So that's pretty important. And then the final point that dovetails on this is we know from the CDC that increasing numbers of both adults and young people self-identify as having a disability, and this has increased over the last decade and is projected to continue to increase. And so I think that where those who have disabilities or know someone with disabilities is increasing, and where it is a voting issue for them, they could potentially become a formidable voting bloc, and I would encourage representatives to actually to pay attention. So you can see that about half of the likely electorate in 2012 said that they did know someone with a disability. And you can see here, this is among all voters, about split on whether or not the government was doing enough. But you can see how it breaks down among those who know someone who has a disability and those who don't. And there's a pretty significant difference there that's outside of the margin of error. So you can see about even among those who do know and less among those who don't. And this is on the voting issue. Would you be more or less likely to vote for a congressional candidate who's committed to making policies and programs to help those with disabilities a national priority? Or does it make no difference? This is among all voters. Most say, no difference, but 41% is not bad. But you can see here how it breaks down when you know someone who has a disability. And this is a big...
Eric, if I can just interrupt.
Sorry, sure.
We actually have several people in the audience who are blind, so if you can read the numbers
Sure.
in addition to show the slide, that would help.
No problem. So if you know someone with a disability, 48% say that it makes you more likely to vote for a candidate who's committed to making policies and programs to help those with disabilities a national priority. That's a 47-point margin, so just 1% say less likely. But if you don't know someone who has a disability, the margin is much smaller, it's 30 points. 33% say more likely compared to 3% less likely. And the big difference there is on those who say it makes no difference. And so if you have a disability or know someone with a disability, you're much more likely to say that it makes a difference in your vote intention.
Thank you, that's great. Whit? And actually, let me say that I asked Whit to really talk about sort of the mindset of conservative voters and Republican primary voters a bit, because I think that's a population that people in the disability community have undervalued as a population that we need to be reaching out to.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for the opportunity to talk with you a little bit about public opinion research and people with disabilities. I have a few remarks here, and then what I'd like to do, Jennifer, it's all right, is leave plenty of time for questions, because people have all kinds of questions about polls and how they're done and how you frame questions and the importance of wording, and we will be happy to go whatever direction you'd like to go on this. First of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to finally meet Dr. Seifert. We have done a lot of work together, but we have never met each other before. Our two firms have done a lot of work together. Stan Greenberg, the founder of her firm, and I did a collaborative poll for NPR during the course of the fall campaign, and we would get on NPR and debate back and forth about the meaning of the language, but we've always worked well together and appreciate any opportunity to collaborate with Erica and her team. Let me start off by saying that I have been struck by how open a number of conservative and Republican groups have been to subjects where I thought they would run me out of the room. Most recently, I've done a lot of polling with very conservative and Republican primary voters on the subject of immigration reform. And I braced myself going into the room, going into the focus group. Rhino, throw them out, we can't stand this, it's a rule of law, blah, 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 blah. And what I got was a very different attitude than I expected. There was no happiness that we had 11 million undocumented people here. But there was widespread recognition that we were not going to deport 11 million undocumented people, that the current system was seriously broken, and that we had to do something to figure out a better way. So that was an opening to leading into a very thorough discussion about immigration reform. One of our clients is Marco Rubio, another one is Lindsey Graham, and you saw that there were two of the people who were very active in trying to lead conservatives and lead Republicans to support immigration reform. I think this may very well be a similar, although much less visible, issue in the minds of the American public generally. I think the key is using language that doesn't put off conservatives and Republicans, and engaging. Republicans who go into Hispanic communities and reach out and try to gain the support of Hispanics do well. Those who don't. And so reaching out to conservatives and making the case in language that they understand and comprehend, I think, is a real opportunity for you and your cause. I'd like to commend Jennifer for getting me thinking about people with disabilities as a political group. People in my business don't normally do that. In fact, Jennifer grabbed me at a conference, CPAC conference, Conservative Political Action Conference, where I actually got heckled for talking about immigration reform. It's one of my first. She reached me down there and said, do you ask a question in your demographics about whether people have disabilities? I thought for a minute and said, no, I don't believe we have. And so she started me thinking about people with disabilities as a political group. It is a group obviously of enormous size and enormous diversity. And that may be one reason why we don't think in those terms. I mean, we might think about people with a particular disability as a voting bloc. But if you're talking about people with mental challenges, people with physical challenges, people with sensory challenges, I mean, it's a huge group of people, but a very, very diverse people, and kind of hard to think about as a unified voting bloc. I think one of the things Erica said was really important. That is, whether or not you know someone who struggles with a disability, who lives with a disability, is a critical component. And you should always, in any polling you do, ask that question. We found that to be enormously influential in the radical change in attitudes toward gay and lesbian rights. People who know someone who is gay just think very differently about all of those issues than people who don't know anyone who's gay or don't think they know anyone who's gay, which may be the case too. Enormous numbers of people, I mean, Erica said it was more than a majority, either have someone in their family with a disability or know a good friend with a disability. I do. And I talked with her about this panel, just to try to get some guidance about what kinds of things would be helpful to say. But I know that having her as a close friend, it has changed my thinking about it, if for no other reason than made me think about things I had not thought about before. And so that's absolutely critical when you're reaching out and when you're engaging, is to find out if people know anyone with a disability. Erica's also exactly right. There's not much public opinion research to draw on. I looked up disability in the Gallup website and came back with 0 matches. I mean, that's a huge firm that's done polling for the better part of 100 years. No matches on the Gallup website, which means that people in the public opinion field just don't think in terms of people with disabilities as a group, as a voting bloc, as something that you need to ask questions about. And so that's an enormous opportunity. It's this giant vacuum for you and for your cause to help generate some data. And by generating the data, you force people like me to think about these issues in a way that we might not have before. So I would strongly encourage you to do more of the kind of work that Erica did to generate some more data and force all of us to think about things like that. An effort to help people with disabilities live happy, fulfilling, and productive lives ought to be a unifying goal for our entire country at a very divisive time. It ought to be. It's interesting in some of the other work that Jennifer's done, she shows the partisan distribution of people with disabilities closely matching that of the country as a whole, which means somewhere around a quarter are Republicans, somewhere around 30% are Democrats. The largest group tends to be independents. That is pretty consistent with the distribution of American adults, not voters. Independents are smaller among voters, but among American adults, about a quarter Republican, 30% Democrat, the rest independent. Independents on spending issues and role of government tend to think more like Republicans than like Democrats. So, what does that mean? That means that using the language of big government Democrats will divide rather than unite your constituency. A message that just says, we need the government to do more, we need the government to spend more, we need the government to get more active here, here, and here, will appeal to that 30% of your constituency or Democrats. It's not going to appeal to a majority of the constituency that's not. So, what does that mean? What kind of language might appeal? Well, I can't give you a well-researched answer because we don't have good research on this, but what I can tell you based on research in other areas like gay rights, like immigration reform, like environmental issues, I can tell you that some language appeals across partisan lines that might apply to your community. The importance of opportunity, the importance of self-sufficiency, the importance of independence, the importance of the Army phrase, the freedom to be all you can be as a human being. All of those kinds of concepts and values appeal not just to conservatives and Republicans, but to Americans across the board. So opportunity, self-sufficiency, independence, freedom to be all that you can be are all sort of unifying words and values that can energize, I think, Americans across the spectrum to assist with people with disabilities. I think anytime you can tie assistance for people with disabilities to economic growth and productivity, you're talking the language of people on my side of the aisle. You have people who have enormous potential, but if that potential is limited by their disability, but there's something you can do to release that potential, quite obviously, that's not just good for that particular individual, it's good for society as a whole, it's good for the economy as a whole. I think a good model as far as advertising goes to look at are all these efforts that people make to hire a vet or hire a disabled veteran that you see on TV all the time or you see in magazines. I mean, they sort of captured and tied into that desire to help people who served their country and who suffered a disability as a result. Now, let me be clear about my comments about government. There's no question that government plays a very important role. I mean, the ADA has opened all kinds of doors, and there's no question that government plays a crucial role. But my message to you today is that your message needs to be broader than just government activism. It needs to be broader than just government activity. Faith-based organizations, civic clubs, service clubs play huge roles that need to be supported and acknowledged. And so talking about institutions in addition to government, not in place of, but in addition to government, I think we'll stand a better chance of unifying the country around a cause that should unify us. In my conversation with my friend with a disability this morning, she stressed the critical importance of education for her in dealing with her disability. She did not know about a lot of things that were available to help her. And so an awful lot of what she did was simply do research to find out what resources were out there, what laws were out there, what things were out there to help her live her life. And this is a rather independent woman. She works for the General Accounting Office. She's been to Iraq, she's been to Afghanistan, she flies all over Afghanistan in an Army helicopter. Hardly the picture of a disabled person, and yet she has a disability on her left side as a result of a stroke. So there are enormous opportunities, I think, for you to generate some data first, and then some language and some messaging that will unify the country around a common goal and will help advance the cause and the opportunities of many people with disabilities in this country. So let me stop there, Jennifer, and we'll open the floor to questions, and we'll stay as long as you want to talk.
That was fabulous, both of you. Let me ask you a question, because I didn't mention it in your introduction, but there's something called the American Association of Political Consultants, which I'd love for you to talk about who they are and how people in the disability community could help educate pollsters such as yourself to start thinking about even asking questions, like how could we connect to the political consulting community?
Well, this is the first month in 20 years that I have not been on the board of the American Association of Political Consultants. Hallelujah. I went through the whole route, the treasurer, vice president, president, chairman, and so forth. And you are going to hear this afternoon from Doc Schweitzer, who is one of the people who roped me into this organization many, many years ago. He's a fascinating guy. You will love hearing Doc. He's got all kinds of stories. A really, really smart guy. I think it would be helpful for you to reach out to them and propose a panel on people with disabilities as a political bloc. As I said, most of us don't even think that way. But they have annual meetings, they have regional meetings, Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington, and then one annual meeting every year. It alternates between the East Coast and the West Coast. And I think it'd be great to have a panel with Jennifer and several other folks on it, just to talk about this issue and raise awareness of this issue among people in the political community. This is a bipartisan organization, explicitly bipartisan, equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans on the board. It is a rather odd organization because we spend all of our lives trying to beat the other guy, and then we sit down across the table and work together. And it creates some interesting situations, because when I was president of the association, Ed Goaz, another prominent Republican pollster, was treasurer of the association. And he and I both had candidates in the gubernatorial primary in Tennessee, different candidates. And so in the morning, we go to our offices and figure out how to beat the other guy. And then in the afternoon, we get together and figure out how to do the finances of AAPC. But you're a professional and you know how to do it. I might mention that my guy is now governor of Tennessee. But minor little point there. But it's president. That's right. No, Bill Haslam, he's a great guy, really.
He is a good guy.
He is. But anyway, that is a good organization, a good opportunity for you.
I think part of the thing in understanding this as a voting bloc is, the research actually is necessary. So we have this meager poll that shows that, perhaps this could be a voting bloc. But in order to convince pollsters, for example, to put, someone with disabilities on a poll, you have to show that it has a causal effect, or that it's going to be a driving demographic. And that's why the research actually is necessary, right? So if you can show that, it could actually be something that people pay much, much more attention to, right? So knowing someone with a disability is going to drive support for this policy, this candidate, this particular message, this way of framing things. And as we can see in this poll, it does appear that that has a significant impact, but we haven't gone through all of the battery of research, and I think that public opinion research can be a really powerful tool in that way. So that's what I would say.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Anil.
Anil Lewis. You said something very key in your description of your friend. You said she doesn't meet the description of a person with a disability.
In my mind.
Right, which is very telling.
Yeah.
Because I think that she does, and that's the description we want people to have of people with disabilities, being capable, fully participating members of society. And it also speaks to the data that you were saying earlier about people who know a person with a disability are more likely to want that government official to help people with disabilities. And then help within the disability community, I think, can be described in two ways: those who want more social programming through supports, et cetera, and those who want more services and programs toward independence. So I guess my question is, how do we drill down to determine more philosophically where the data lies? Whether it's people who have a positive perception of people with disabilities, or people who have a custodialistic perception of people with disabilities. Because your perspective of people with disabilities could have changed if your friend was someone who stayed at home, didn't have a lot to live for, didn't think that she had a lot to live for, required a lot of support, et cetera. Your perception of the capacity may have been altered. So how do we drill down? How do we get more public opinion polls to drill down to that?
The question you're asking is exactly what Erica and I do for a living. We construct questions that do exactly what you're talking about, that drill down, that get at people's attitudes about people with disabilities or people with different kinds of disabilities. We would ask if they know someone who has that particular disability, and if they have changed as a result, and why. What my friend has shown me is that despite the fact that she has severe difficulty walking and walks with a brace and a cane, she can do almost anything, at least as far as her job is concerned. And yes, that has changed my view about it. But at doing a survey of Americans on that subject is exactly what Erica is saying we need, and I agree, and constructing the questions to get at exactly the questions you're talking about is part of what we do for a living.
So that's part of the reason why our question here is so vague. It's vote for a candidate who would, make this a national priority. Because we didn't have a lot of time on the poll. If we were to go to focus groups first, right, talk to people, what do you think of when I say a person with a disability? We would be able to get the texture of that language and figure out, what is it that people call to mind when they think about people with disabilities. And then we would do a fuller poll where we weren't just asking, make this a national priority, which is rather vague, and it's not about, government spending more money or, government, taking over things, and it's not about, investment. But those are things that we would need to tease out more carefully in public opinion research.
How do we support that research? How do we?
Well, our organization, RespectAbility, was really founded to deal with that particular problem. If you look at our brand new budget, which is on our website, $500,000 of our $1.2 million goal budget is public opinion research, to have people like this do real substance, to put real data out there and get it into the marketplace. I think it's the most important thing. Frankly, to unlocking the potential of Americans with disabilities is helping the politicians understand the hopes, dreams, expectations of Americans with disabilities. Last night we did do a focus group of Republicans who work either in think tanks or on Capitol Hill. And when we said, when you think of the word disability, what's the first word that comes to mind? And everybody had to write it down. The first word for almost everyone was fraud, and the other word that came up was lawsuit. That those were the only two perceptions. Was that people are gaming the system, who are unemployed, who. I must say it was very moving to see that people have a perception that somebody who, like yourself, who's blind or who is in a wheelchair has a legitimate disability. But somebody with ADHD or who with bipolar disorder, who has Asperger's, but you can't physically see the difference, there are basically three categories. There's legitimate disabilities, of which, if you happen to get them fighting in a battle for America, is like the best kind of disability to have. And then there's a visible disability that you can see that somebody's blind or in a wheelchair. Then there's people who have, bipolar disorder or something that's sensory or whatever it is that they can't see. And then there's the fraud. But when we ask people what percent of people who are on disability are, sort of the fraud squad, it was generally people thought 20%, and as high as 50% was fraud. And the best example for that was that every single one of them had seen Tammy Duckworth talking about the fraud within veteran disability and what that meant to her as a person with a legitimate disability, to have somebody scamming the system. So it was very interesting to see, though, in the focus group, they also felt very strongly that the disability community, like everyone else who comes to see them, is interested in money, just a piece of the pie. But they were very, very excited about the possibility of helping people with disabilities get jobs, so that they could become, I wrote it down, Whit said, he predicted without seeing the focus group that it would be opportunity, freedom to be all you can be, and self-sufficiency, which is exactly what the focus group showed. And they were willing to invest in programs that would help people find jobs, stay in jobs, and even to help subsidize their living allowance during the transition period. So if somebody's first job was 20 hours a week, and it wasn't going to give them as much money as being on disability, the government could potentially, in the short term, fill a gap that could, in the long term, help them not be on disability. They were most motivated also when we asked what was the most important issue that they care about. It was the high cost of. And the high cost of what that was, whether it's education or healthcare or whatever, varied person to person. as to what issue they were concerned about the high cost of, but high cost of was a huge concern, and the amount of money, the $450 billion in benefits to people with disability is a significant number. But clearly one of our strongest goals at RespectAbility is to have Whit and Green and her and Erica's team do significant polling work, including and especially in Republican primary and Democratic early primary states, caucus states. We're talking New Hampshire and Iowa.
You want to moderate here?
Thank you.
Sorry.
You want to moderate, or should we?
Yeah. No. Please go ahead, Whit.
Yes, sir.
I was actually quite surprised that you saw no results in your search of the Gallup archive. But have polls been conducted on things such as special education, access to the legal system, things that have direct impacts on individuals with disabilities without using the word disability? Have you guys seen any of that kind of polling data? I mean, I'm aware of disability organizations having done polls and having commissioned organizations like the University of Michigan to do polls. So I'm really surprised that there's very little out there. Can you comment on some of the subject matter polling that may exist?
Yeah, I think some of the difference between the academic polls or the nonprofit polls is first of all, a lot of them are pretty targeted, but the key piece that's missing, and this is sort of what we specialize in, is writing the messages, right? So it's not just the statistical data, like this many people have self-identify as having a disability. The CDC can give us that really accurately, and they do. This is about crafting a message to move a policy, right, or to move action, and so a lot of people aren't doing that kind of research, right? The kind of in-depth research that we would do on behalf of a candidate or on behalf of the organization I work for, which is Democracy Corps. So I think that that's pretty important because we would, as Jennifer was saying, she went in focus group, you have to start there, right? You have to get the language right, you have to tease it out, and then you have to conduct a national poll and see what is actually powerful. Or you would do it in a congressional district, or you would do it in an early primary state, or in order to figure out what is going to move things, not just this many people believe this, that, and the other thing. We can get those statistics pretty easily.
So are you saying that polls on efficacy of special education practices or polls on disability employment policy are simply missing the mark?
No, that's really useful data, and we would also get that kind of data, and we would use it in our crosstabs, right, to see, people who believe this, are moved by this message. The only special education work that we've done has been on behalf of, for example, education organizations, and that research shows the same thing. People are, strongly supportive of investment in special education and the distribution of resources for special education if they work in special education, have a child in special education, or their child has a friend in special education. That's where you get your strongest support, but for a lot of other people, it's not on their radar, or there are those who are more conservative who worry that special education is draining resources from the mainstream classroom. So there is that kind of work that I've done.
Well, so I guess I'm confused then, because I thought you were saying that there isn't all that much polling data, and now you're saying that there may be some polling data. So I'm not sure.
That's very particular to special education. But if we're talking about polls that look into messages to action, that kind of thing, there is a lack of resources when it comes to public opinion data. People who have self-identify as having a disability, or policy related to supporting those with disabilities.
Okay. A couple things. First of all, that doesn't surprise me because Republicans are not callous, they're clueless. And I am a Republican, so I can say that. And there are many of them who are absolutely clueless, who don't understand what what supported employment and what Social Security disability and Social Security income is all about and why it's necessary. And when you explain it to them, all of a sudden they kind of start getting it. And what got me in the door with a lot of legislators was, well, let me talk to you about some policy changes that would drastically reduce that number of money that we were spending on it. And all of a sudden the doors were open. My big question is, first of all, who devises the questions on the polls? How do you guys come up with the questions?
We do.
Okay. Is there a way that, like, you know, like this panel that you're talking about that we ought to have for the political consultants, is there a way that we could develop a database for you of people with disabilities who could help you with those questions? Because I think that that's where I see the disconnect.
Sure.
Is that the right people aren't driving the questions?
The people who have an interest in a particular policy are frequently not the best people to write the questions. Because it comes out, don't you think that the government should help those of us who are struggling? I mean, and they're just...
Sounds like that's worded properly. That's good.
Yeah, that's
But so that the questions make sense.
I think the most important thing, though, is if you're talking about a broader population, right, that the questions make sense to them. So that's why we would go into focus groups, you know, with people who self-identify as having a disability, people who know someone, but then also people who don't.
Okay, that's what I'm
Those
getting
are the
at.
people you need to convince, right?
Yeah.
You don't need
Oh, yeah.
to convince the people who
No. That's I've not made myself clear. I apologize. You just answered the question that you get from all perspectives. Because if it's only from somebody sitting in a white room with no windows who goes, okay, should we ask about, does the government do an appropriate job taking care of people with disabilities?
I have a window in my office.
I have to have a window in mine for the vitamin D. So.
There's a question way in the back.
Can you offer some historical perspective on where we are on that curve between cluelessness and people understanding the relevance to the entire American population of the issue at hand? I mean, we can talk about the last 10 years, the absolute transformation of that LGBT issue. So, and there are other issues that with women's liberation and civil rights. Can you talk about how we get to that game-changing pivot point from we have these issues to this is something that matters to the whole population?
It's a good question. My sense is that we are way down on the low end of the curve. If you think about what changed the whole gay rights issue, it was a combination, I think, of a lot of media exposure. I mean, Ellen, Glee, I mean, seeing gay people as, you know, people, regular people, if you will. A lot of it was more people coming out and therefore more people knowing that they knew a gay person. A lot of it was role models. Dick and Lynn Cheney are two of the most rock-ribbed conservatives anywhere in the country. If Dick and Lynn Cheney can have a gay daughter, it's probably not environmental. Yeah. And so, just speculating there. But so, I mean, you had the combination of things that drove public opinion faster than I've ever seen public opinion change on any other issue. Contrast that with abortion. Attitudes about abortion today, in broad outline, should it be generally available under all circumstances, available under some circumstances, but not others, or not available, or not legal. Opinions today are almost identical to what they were in 1973 when Roe versus Wade was passed. Almost identical. And so you've got gay rights on one hand just going crazy as far as the change goes, and abortion that's just like a flat line, just completely stable. So it is a challenge to increase the visibility, but some of the discussion today is the way to do that. And based on the two things y'all have said, talking about the cost of disability benefits under Social Security and ways to promote opportunity, freedom, independence, and reduce that cost, all of a sudden you've got a lot of Republicans going, hey, tell me more.
Yeah, talk to me.
Talk to me. Yes, sir.
I think also one of the first things you have to do demographically, and I think it's good that you're going to do the polling, is number one, show that there are voters with disabilities. Two, show that people with disabilities do vote high percentages, and 3 show that that's a voting bloc that can move.
Yep.
If you give them a message.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm a former legislator and a caucus director. I never asked a demographic question in a poll about people with disabilities.
Yeah.
You know, none of my pollsters ever submitted questions about disability issues, and we did the same: health, education, jobs, blah, blah, blah. We never targeted that, and I should have known that.
Yeah.
But no one was thinking about that, and I think that's why it's good to get political consultants, because if they see us as voters that they can move in close elections with some messaging, then they're going to try some messaging, because they see us as people that can move. And I think the demographics shocked a lot of people, not me so much, but that it was 30-25. And a lot of people, that's a lot of available voters to chase.
Yep, you need to write down what you just said. I mean, that is exactly on target about what you need to do to create the sense of a voting bloc that is identifiable, that is movable if you reach out with these messages. That's right on target. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question, because I feel like a lot of our issues, people on both sides of the aisle agree with, that they get lost in other issues, and like with the disability treaty, that it's not really about disabilities, it's about other issues that have nothing to do with people with disabilities. I work for faith-based IDD service providers who, most are Republicans probably, but passionately care about Medicaid and long-term care and long-term services and supports, but that's lost in a whole other, argument about like greedy geezers and things like that. And so how do you, so how do you separate the, I guess that's really what is, we'll talk to someone and they'll agree, yeah, we need to support these services, but it's sort of in this whole other package, and how do you tease those out and get support for these issues?
You run a campaign. We do for a living. You run a campaign with those people. You get your data, you get your messages, you make appointments, and you sit down with them and you educate them about the potential of this group as a political force. But it takes a campaign. Campaigns matter. Campaigns change minds. Campaigns make a difference. And you run your own campaign.
I mean, we all know about, powerful interest groups, right? They just didn't happen. They don't just exist, right? They run campaigns, right? They have advocacy on their behalf. And I would say, we've talked a lot about Republicans, but I think it's also important to hold Democrats accountable, because especially in an era of reduced budgets where Democrats have a lot of priorities, a lot of places where they want to spend a lot of money, it also has to be, a priority for Democrats. So I would say, there is a way in which Democrats might take this for granted, because it does seem like an investment issue, right? That's something that Democrats love. But I do think it's important for voters to also hold Democrats and progressives accountable.
Absolutely.
Have you guys had occasion, or could there be occasions where you would look at disability-related polling in the context of referendum questions? These are not necessarily specific candidates. These are referendum questions which happen all the time in the country.
Yep.
Can you talk about some?
Sure, depending on the state, if they have a referendum or initiative. I've got a lot of friends who make a very good living doing nothing but initiatives and referenda in California. It's a huge business in our business, a huge slice of business. So sure, I mean, there are petition drives. I mean, it costs a lot of money to get petitions to get on the ballot and to drive messaging around it to advertise, particularly in a state like California. But that is potential, as if you have a specific referendum idea that you want to try to pass.
There are definitely discount states where you could deal with ballot initiatives, but if you're talking about California, it's in the several to double-digit millions of dollars to even play. But there are states where it's much, much cheaper to run a ballot initiative.
Yes, sir.
I just want to offer, when you were talking about moving the LGBT message further down the curve, I think the one component that tends to get overlooked is the LGBT community is engaged in decision-making roles, right? They're either Hill staffers, actually elected officials who may or may not have come out. And I think that the disability community is not leveraging our capacity to engage in that way. I've seen some people with disabilities serve on the Hill as staffers, and usually those officers are more friendly to a disability agenda. But that's one way that curve is removed, and we have to focus on doing that as well. If we become part of that decision-making process, become part of that infrastructure, then our agenda will also be moved a little further, a little more progressively down that curve.
Agreed. Other questions? Well, thank you. Thank you for the chance to talk about this, and we wish you the very best of luck.
Whit Ayres was fabulous. Thank you so very much. We really, really appreciate it, and we look forward to getting some poll data from you guys in the future, so we have real numbers to work on that are